Today at the National Press Club, the Shadow Treasurer Angus Taylor. A week after the federal government handed down its budget forecasting a slim surplus, the opposition says not enough is being done to combat inflation and cost of living pressures. Angus Taylor with today's National Press Club address.
Hello and welcome to the National Press Club of Australia and the Westpac address coming to you from the Ngunnawal and Ngambri country. My name is Tom Connell. I'm a political host at Sky News and also a director here at the club. Our guest today, the Honourable Angus Taylor MP, the Shadow Treasurer as well. He's been in Parliament since 2013, rose through the ranks quite quickly, up in the Cabinet by 2018. The pretty difficult portfolio, I think it's fair to say, of energy and emissions reduction. And it was a quick rise. His name has been mentioned over the years as a potential leader of the party. We'll see if that makes an appearance in his speech today or otherwise. I think there's more likely to be a focus on his response, of course, to Labor's budget. You can follow the conversation on Twitter at PressClubAust or hashtag NPC. Please welcome Angus Taylor.
Well, thank you, Tom. Thank you to the Press Club for giving this opportunity to give my second speech in less than a year here at the Press Club. And thank you to the many colleagues in attendance here today. My federal colleagues, Paul Fletcher, Dean Smith, Michaelia Cash, Bridget McKenzie and Holly Hughes, and my former federal colleagues, former Speaker Tony Smith, great to see Tony here, Zed Zelja, and then the many ACT colleagues who are here as well, Jeremy Hanson, Leanne Castley, Mark Parton, Peter Kane and Ed Cox. It's great to have you all here today. I want to start by asking a question, a very simple question. Do you feel better off than a year ago? I ask this question of many Australians and I get a very consistent answer. Inflation hurts all Australians. The impact of inflation is not limited to a few. I witnessed this firsthand growing up in the tiny village of Nimidabel, a couple of hours south of here, in the 1970s and the 1980s. In many ways, this was the reason I first became interested in economics. We were living inflation every single day. I saw neighbours, good family investments, good family businesses who had made investments, growing their business, borrowed money, only to see inflation and high interest rates devastate their plans. Persistent inflationary pressure is the new crisis for this government. Bringing down cost of living pressures and delivering long-term economic growth is hard government, requiring hard choices just like those that the coalition made during the pandemic. Now, we all remember the challenge before us in March 2020, and we probably would prefer to forget, is the reality. But a crisis that required difficult decisions, required governments of all persuasions to challenge their instincts, was in front of us at that time. It required policymakers to respond to the demands at the time and do so quickly, without the luxury of time. And that's exactly what we did. And because of these policies, Australia achieved a remarkable V-shaped recovery and emerged from the pandemic in a better position than most or all countries we benchmark ourselves against. Record low unemployment, record number of apprentices in training, and a budget that from the moment the East Coast states reopened was in surplus. From the moment the East Coast states opened up. From November 2021, when Victoria and New South Wales left lockdown, to today, the Department of Finance has published 17 months of financial accounts. The monthly figures show that from the moment the East Coast emerged from lockdown and travel restrictions began to ease, the government experienced a net underlying cash balance surplus of $33 billion. That's going back to November 2021. As respected economist Chris Richardson has pointed out, the net debt to GDP has returned to where it was prior to the pandemic. But just as the pandemic crisis required constant adaptation and response, so too does the current environment. With inflation raging across our economy, this is the crisis government has to deal with now. Hard-working families are climbing a mountain day in, day out to pay the bills and to support their children. A typical family paying off their home is $25,000 a year worse off than they were a year ago. Hit hard by higher mortgage costs, taxes, energy bills and other rising costs of living. Families like Nicole and Dougie from Goulburn, my hometown, raising 2 children in a home they recently bought. They're paying an additional $890 a month on their mortgage. And while their increases are less than many, Nicole is facing the possibility she might have to go back to work earlier than she had thought or wanted after a second child just to help make ends meet. Then there's Corey and Sarah, young parents working hard to pay off their home in Perth. They're everyday victims of inflation, struggling under the pain of rising interest rates, higher grocery bills and skyrocketing energy bills. Corey said, "What this budget has said to all Australians is the government hasn't listened to any of us. The government hasn't listened to any of us. There is no help for us in this budget." Small business owners Brianna and Alex are feeling the pinch of rising expenses due to high inflation. The parents of 2 have had to pull back on their hiring of extra staff and cut back on their own spending. Now, these are just a few examples of working couples faced with difficult decisions so they can keep paying their bills and putting food on the table. The choices are stark. Do they pull their children out of sport or cancel the family holiday? Does dad take on a second job or weekend work? Or does mum go back to full-time work while the kids are still babies? Lifeline reports that 80% of its calls now, 80% of its calls relate to cost of living. Deloitte Access Economics estimates that approximately 300,000 Australians are living in negative cash flow. High inflation means that hard-working Australians who want to get ahead are only going backwards. It risks the creation of a new generation of working poor. Now, there's a deep conflict between our current economic context and the economic orthodoxy many have supported in recent times, particularly during the pandemic. We've become accustomed to hearing, particularly from our political opponents, that more government and more spending is the solution to all economic challenges. But inflation economics is fundamentally different. Fundamentally different. Big government makes the situation worse. American economist Eric Leeper has documented the many mistakes that governments made through the 60s, 70s and 80s that led to inflation getting out of control and remaining untamed. The mistakes can be characterised very simply. Governments responding by treating the symptoms, not the source of inflation. Treating the symptoms, not the source. This budget makes that very mistake. It gives with one hand while taking away with the other with higher prices and higher taxes. It means the Reserve Bank is slamming the brakes at the same time as the government has the foot on the accelerator, and when you do that, you wreck the engine. A year into this government, Australia has one of the highest core inflations levels amongst major economies. At 6.6%, our core inflation is higher than the UK at 6.2%, the US 5.6%, Canada 4.3%, Euro area at 5.7%. Headline inflation remains stubbornly high, particularly in our services sector. The RBA's latest monetary policy decision should have rung out like an alarm bell through the government about the urgency of the challenge. It was truly a wake-up call. Australians are making, as I said, hard choices every day, yet they are not seeing a government with the willingness to do the same. Inflation now is coming from Canberra, not the Kremlin, and it's Canberra's problem to solve. Inflation will be stronger for longer if governments deny the problem and adopt the wrong solutions. And while many argue that the principles that have driven coalition economic policy have become less relevant in the recent past, the values that drive us give us the right toolkit for the time. The right toolkit for the time. We believe that private business drives opportunity and prosperity, not big government. We believe that fiscal discipline is necessary to take pressure off prices. Lower taxes, balanced budgets, spending growth restraint are all essential. We believe that productivity reforms are the key to making life easier, removing supply-side constraints and setting up the economy for medium to longer term growth. And we believe in backing hard-working, aspirational Australians to get ahead, to lift all Australians together. This is the pathway back to a low inflation, high growth economy. But by focusing on the system, the symptoms, the budget divides Australia into the worthy few and the forgotten. The forgotten including small businesses, middle income families, mortgage holders, farmers, truckies, regional communities and many others. Less inflation is good for all Australians, not just a few, for every single one of us. And rather than dividing the country, lower inflation brings the country together, giving all Australians a pathway to prosperity, giving every Australian the opportunity to fulfil their goals. And that is exactly what Peter Dutton outlined in his budget reply speech. Peter has clearly laid out that there are differences in the approach we would take. There are also places where we can find common ground with the government. We've again reiterated our support for ensuring that the NDIS is sustainable. As we did with the RBA review, I think very well this is something we're prepared to work with the government on in a collaborative way. The NDIS is too important. Securing its future should be above all politics. Now, well ahead of this budget, we were clear on the need for fiscal constraint and other sensible measures to take pressure off Australian households and businesses. It was a simple test for any party that seeks to claim it can manage the economy. Instead, we saw the opposite. We saw $185 billion of new spending since Labor came to office. $185 billion of new spending in the last year. $2 of new spending initiatives for every dollar of revenue initiatives. It's 2 to 1. Poorly planned migration that the Treasurer's own budget papers say will drive up housing costs in the budget papers. A fiscal strategy that removed fighting inflation from what was already called, I quote, the weakest fiscal strategy in living memory, quoting there the economist Stephen Hamilton. A failure to heed the calls of major business groups and economists to restore the fiscal guardrails that had been in the fiscal strategy since 1996, including a commitment to budget balance. And as has been pointed out by the Australian Financial Review's John Keogh, this budget even walks away from the Treasurer's one fiscal rule in the last budget. Far from returning 99% of the revenue windfalls to the bottom line, as promised in October, the government has banked just 40% of improvements in the bottom line since PFO and spent 60% or more of the massive windfall from strong commodities and job markets. Now, no one wins from a big spending government in an inflation crisis. At best, the budget fails to address inflation. At worst, it adds fuel to the fire. There is a credible case that it is actually making things worse. Rich Insights Director Chris Richardson said he, and I quote, had thought that the Reserve Bank was done and dusted, but this has notably raised the chance they will do another swing of the baseball bat. S&P Global Ratings disputed the government's forecast, stating we expect inflation to be stubbornly higher than the Reserve Bank's target until fiscal 2026, and that handouts in today's budget may add to inflationary pressures. And BetaShares Chief Economist David Bassis calls the budget unambiguously expansionary. Now, it's concerning to see the Treasurer, who spent more time spinning budgets than studying them, dismissing the views of economists so easily. Meanwhile, the government seems to have spent the last week trying to work out who this budget is supposed to help, rather than being focused on who it was supposed to help from the start. Middle Australia was not spoken of in the lead up to the budget or in the Treasurer's budget speech. And yet, in the post-budget wash-up, the Treasurer mentioned Middle Australia 41 times. The Prime Minister, 15 times in his media appearances and counting. I'm sure we'll hear many more. Labor can try to spin its way out of a budget failure, but it won't change the fact that there is no light at the end of the tunnel for hard-working Australians who are trying to get ahead. Given the strength of commodity prices, the jobs market, the trend of monthly surpluses I've described coming out of the pandemic, it's been clear that a drover's dog could have delivered a surplus this year. It's essential the government do the same next year, and it's also within reach to deliver ongoing budget balance. This is the true test for Labor. It's not easy, but it can be done, and we know this because we did it. Prior to the pandemic, the Coalition in 2019 balanced the budget, and then we did this while increasing spending on essential services, growing defence spending to over 2% of GDP, and supporting the creation of more than 1 million jobs and 250,000 businesses. And the key to it was we got the economy to grow faster than our spending. Now, the path to fiscal consolidation is not to tax Australians more. Labor's fiscal strategy sets no cap on tax growth and contains no commitment to private sector-led growth. This is the wrong strategy. Higher taxes stifle investment, innovation and aspiration. As economist Alberto Alesina has shown us, tax-driven fiscal improvements damage growth compared with containment of spending growth. Simply put, you cannot tax your way into economic prosperity, just as you can't spend your way out of high inflation. Australians struggling with the cost of living will see taxes rise on top of ever-increasing prices. But worse, some of these taxes are bound to be passed right onto consumers' bills. The truckies tax adding to the cost of food and freight. $153 million tax on our farmers. Labor's franking credits and super taxes will be directly felt by self-funded retirees and pensioners alike. And bracket creep, the tax you don't notice until you look at the impact on your bank account, is eating away at Australians' earning power. The budget papers show income tax as a percent of GDP growing over the forwards. And over the next 5 years, the tax paid by Australians will increase by more than $300 billion. $300 billion. Now, this budget has abandoned tax incentives that support innovation, investment and productivity that grow the economy. The patent box regime has been abandoned. The technology investment boost has not been extended. And whilst we welcome the retention of the instant asset write-off, the government has decimated its asset value cap and removed access to the investment allowance for medium-sized businesses. Labor's big spending, high taxing, high regulation agenda risks putting us into a period of stagflation. Inflation and low economic growth are a very dangerous combination, a very dangerous cocktail. And it's why the government's committed to, or the coalition is committed to, restoring the same fiscal rules that delivered lower taxes and a balanced budget in 2019. It's why the coalition is committed to restoring the tax to GDP cap. It's why we're committed to delivering the stage 3 tax cuts. And it's why we continue to fight Labor's broken promises on taxes to superannuation and franking credits. Now, strong economic growth over the short term and into the longer term is essential to boosting quality of life. And at a time where inflation is making quality of life, standard of living worse, productivity gains are the only pathway to ensure Australians can realise their aspirations over the medium to long term, making it easier to do a job or run a business, making it easier for customers to get a better deal or engage with government services. The McKinsey Global Institute has highlighted that productivity reform is essential to solving the challenges confronting most advanced economies, ranging from labour market shortages, debt, inflation and energy challenges. The Reserve Bank minutes from April have sounded the alarm bell on productivity, but the government isn't listening. The government talks a lot about productivity to justify billions of dollars of extra expenditure, yet its own budget shows a deteriorating productivity position despite the spending. The Productivity Commission's 5-year review has all but been buried, with not a single measure in budget paper number 2, a direct response to the recommendations made, not a single measure responding to those recommendations. Worse, the budget throws up challenges to productivity and economic growth, particularly when it comes to people and energy. Now, the budget has the Australian population growing by substantially more than Adelaide over the next 5 years, but with no plan to address housing supply, infrastructure needs and other services required to make that growth successful. We all support a well-planned migration program, and that's the history of coalition governments. But over 5 years, net overseas migration will see our population increase by over 1.5 million people. It's the biggest migration surge in our country's history, and it's occurring amidst a housing and rental crisis. Migration is an enormous part of our history and has been critical to our economic success, our culture, our lifestyles and who we are. I saw the enormous power of aspirational migrants as a kid growing up near Cooma, south of here, one of the proudest migrant communities in Australia. More than 100,000 people from over 30 countries travelled to the Snowies after the Second World War for work on the Snowy scheme. So whilst migration will continue to serve us well into the future, it only works if you have a complementary plan around the infrastructure, the housing and the services that are required. Instead, the government is cutting infrastructure spending in real terms and reallocating it to their pet projects. Now, if you talk to any business, big or small, around Australia right now, they'll tell you that one of their biggest supply constraints remains labour shortages. We have record job vacancies of over 435,000 people. Alongside managed migration, there is an opportunity to give more Australians the incentive to get into work or increase the hours of work they're doing. A high proportion of the 550,000 unemployed Australians are capable of working more than 30 hours a week. And there is nothing like a job to improve somebody's life. Australians on JobSeeker face effective marginal tax rates of up to 60 cents in the dollar. This is a huge disincentive to work at a time when the economy and job seekers can't afford it. It's why Peter Dutton announced our proposal to increase the amount a job seeker could earn before their payment is affected. This is a common sense policy that could boost the income of someone on JobSeeker that works not by $40 a fortnight, but by up to $300. It's similar to the pension work bonus we championed, and the government ended up implementing a version of it at least, not the full version, but a version last year. We've suggested this is a bipartisan, constructive way because we think this is ultimately better for those on JobSeeker, but also for the country, because it will help to put downward pressure on inflation. Another major barrier to growth is energy prices going in the wrong direction, alongside Labor's attacks on the gas sector, a sector we need to support lower emissions and lower energy prices. Between the gas caps, the PRRT, the safeguard mechanism, delayed approvals and the abandoning of carbon capture and storage incentives, one of our largest export industries is under attack from the government. It's a death by 1,000 cuts to an industry that has powered our nation and our economy for so many years. It is one of Australia's great success stories, and just as Australia needs it to be successful, so too do so many of our customer countries throughout Asia. Meanwhile, most hard-working Australians will not benefit a cent from the government's cost of living relief, despite because of power bills increasing by more than $500 for a typical household. A more prosperous Australia demands a sharp focus on a low inflation and high growth economy. And in Peter Dutton's budget reply, he made several down payments on an agenda that will promote growth in the medium term, supporting gas as a medium-term energy source and removing barriers to nuclear energy, restoring mental health sessions to Medicare so Australians can be healthier at a time of crisis that we're seeing for so many, committing to a tax to GDP cap that will incentivise productivity in government, and repealing Labor's super tax. The starting point for real action on growth and productivity is to take action to support businesses to lower costs and keep strong employment right across our economy. Now, $1 today is worth less than it was a year ago. $1 today is worth less than it was a year ago. And this government's policies risk inflation and interest rates that are higher for longer, prolonging the pain. Australians trying to get ahead will be the ones who pay the biggest price. The Coalition has been clear that we would not have delivered this budget. Our priority would be to bring down inflation and set up Australia for growth in the medium term through lower taxes and growth-enhancing policies. This would take pressure off prices and prevent a generation of Australians becoming the working poor. It would support the Reserve Bank by having a fiscal policy pulling in the same direction as monetary policy, and it would set up Australians for the future they deserve. Thank you very much.
All right, let's go to some questions. I'll begin. Thank you very much for your speech. And just to start with on what you said around budget balance, you said it's within reach to deliver ongoing budget balances, and that's the test for Labor. Yep. In terms of the Coalition delivering on that, so you've got a tax to GDP limit of 23.9%. If we go to the year 26-27, the first year you'd be able to deliver a budget, to stick to that tax speed limit and have a budget balance, you'd have to bring spending down in the order of $65 billion. Is that what the fat you could trim? $65 billion in that year, you think?
Well, no, let's be clear. What you have to do to get back to budget balance, Tom, and this is the crucial point, is to make sure your economy is growing faster than you're spending. And as long as you can follow that formula, you can get yourself back to budget balance. That's the key. That has been absolutely central to our approach when we were in government. Between 2013 and 2019, we did exactly that. It was hard work. But we did exactly that. And that would be our focus. Now, there are areas
So would it be
spending.
longer term cuts, not in 1 year? Is that what you're indicating
Well,
there?
we're not handing down the alternative budget. I mean, I wish we were handing down a budget, but we're not handing down an alternative budget. What we are, though, is laying out the pathway and the principles that we would apply if we were in government and when, as we hope, we do get back into government. So, that's the approach we're taking here.
Okay.
I would say, there's some very clear areas of spending that we have said need a very long, hard look at. I mean, $45 billion of spending that we have rejected over recent months, $18 billion of interest costs associated with it. And, sometimes in government, what's most important is what you don't do, not just what you do. And we've said that it's just not an appropriate time to be spending that money. And these are very real areas where we've parted company on already from the government.
Okay, I know there's an obsession on a surplus. Let's not have a surplus of questions, though, today for the journalists. Boom, boom. Dan Jarvis-Sparty from the West Australian kicks us off.
Thank you for your speech, Mr Taylor. Can we go to the issue of gas? You spoke about it in the speech. You're clearly critical of the government's approach, and as the opposition leader said in the budget reply speech, the Coalition wants to do more to support it. Can you just elaborate on exactly what you would do to get more supply into the system and support gas? And how do you respond to the inevitable criticism that will come from the government that when you were in government, you pursued the gas-fired recovery from COVID, and that came to very little?
Well, Dan, we saw remarkable growth in the gas industry in our time in government. Remarkable growth in the gas industry. And the process of doing that supported customer countries like Japan and Korea and China to reduce their emissions and to move to what is a cleaner energy source than would otherwise have been the case. And, that was policy that we drove for a long period of time. Getting rid of the carbon tax was central to that. Then you ask about the specific policies that we'd have. I mean, I think I've already outlined a number of the things that Labor is doing that we would oppose. I mean, really, Labor is creating barriers. We've been very clear about a number of those policies of Labor's that we're opposed to. We opposed the imposition of that heavy-handed intervention in the gas market with the legislation that went through late last year. We've obviously taken a very strong view on the safeguard mechanism and the impact that will have on the gas industry. We've always had a view that you've got to see approvals through on a smooth basis, and that's been a major issue for many of the gas producers and will continue to be. But the important point here is you either see this as an industry that's an important part of our future in getting down emissions for us and our customer countries, or you don't. And it's clear from what Labor's doing with the death by 1,000 cuts approach they're taking that they don't see it as part of the mix. The real question for them is how do they think energy systems are going to work for industry, for firming up electricity over the coming years if there's not enough gas?
Next question, Jen Beshwadi from Network 7.
Hello. My question's on migration. If 1.5 million is too many, what's the right number?
Well, the right number depends on those complementary initiatives. This is the point. If you want complementarities in policy, this is the place to look. You can't have that kind of immigration number without supporting policies on infrastructure, on housing, on other services. Otherwise, you end up with communities that are completely underserved, where congestion grows, and, you know, we see that. We see that. I mean, we learned that. When Bob Carr declared that Sydney was shut, many of you remember that, soon after the Sydney Olympics, he'd run out of money, so he decided Sydney was shut. What he meant to say was the population's going to continue, but they're not going to support it with any investment. And the result was an absolute disaster. It was a complete disaster. Now, that is what we have to avoid here. We, as I said, and I can't emphasise enough, I personally am I'm pro sensible levels of immigration, but you can't do it without those complementary plans. And the reality of this budget is not only was it lacking in complementary plans, the budget itself made the point that in housing, for instance, that there was an unsolved problem.
So right now then, what is the number you think that we should...
Well, the number depends on those complementary initiatives. That's the point.
So
That's the point.
You don't know what the number should be?
So you've got... Well, it's not our budget, it's Labor's, but the point is that you've got to make sure that you have the housing, the infrastructure, the services, the sporting fields. I mean, all the things that in, you know, the northern part of my electorate we're dealing with every single day. You've got to have all of that working in parallel, and the problem with this budget is it's not.
In other words, if it's 1.5 million and that's a forecast rather than Labor's plan, you want more spending?
Well, it was in the budget. It was in the budget. That was the reality.
You want more spending?
It was in the... No, we want the complementary initiatives. I mean, you've got to work out how to accommodate.
You've got to spend.
And this is the point.
Initiatives.
Well, it's about priorities. It's about where you spend your money at the end of the day.
Next question comes from Phil Curry from the Australian Financial Review.
Thank you, Thomas. Mr Taylor, just on the PRRT, you don't sound like a fan of what was in the budget in terms of the change. I know the party is yet to make its decision. The gas industry is telling us, and I'm sure yourself or your colleagues, that they can live with this and they would rather you passed it than push Labor onto the Greens in the Senate, who say the increase is manifestly inadequate and will drive a higher, push for a higher take. Is that a concern of yours, or are you telling us, are you flagging you're going to oppose that and let Labor do what they may?
Well, I'm not going to get ahead of our processes, Phil. I mean, we saw the budget last week and we're working through. You've got to remember, there's $185 billion of spending in this budget. There's a lot of initiatives we've got to work our way through, and we will, and we'll do it systematically and methodically, and I'll respect my colleagues in that process. But I mean, there's a couple of principles here that I think are important, regardless of the outcome of that. Number one is, if you want more of something, you don't tax it more. It's pretty simple. It's pretty basic economics, but that's what Labor's chosen to do here, and it's disappointing that that's their approach more generally. I mean, we need the gas to, as I say, bring down emissions and deliver affordable energy, and we will for a number of years yet. So, taxing more strikes me as the wrong way to go about that. But we'll work our way through it. We want a gas industry that's successful in this country, not one that's dying by death by 1,000 cuts. And so we'll work our way through it systematically.
Poppy Johnston from AAP.
Thanks for your speech. You've pointed out that the government has done little to act on productivity reform so far, but the Coalition's track record on productivity has also fallen short. Were you in the Treasurer's position, what concrete measure would be your priority to boost productivity?
Well, there's a number of things I've already talked about in the speech. I mean, number one is getting energy policy right. I mean, if you're driving up the price of energy, that is going to impact on your productivity, because energy is right throughout our economy. It's everywhere you look. It is making sure that you've got a growth policy for the number of people in the country that is consistent with your housing, with your services, with your infrastructure. There's no bigger hit to productivity than sitting in traffic in Sydney on a tollway for hours on end. I mean, it's a massive hit to productivity. That's why work from home has become so popular, because people want to avoid those trips. Now, if they're going to get a lot longer, you're going to really hit productivity hard. So, there's a whole range of areas. I mean, I think the Productivity Commission's review was a very good piece of work. Labor has absolutely buried it. I think there needs to be a sensible debate about what was in that proposal, and a large range of sensible recommendations. This is about making people's lives easier, not harder, making their jobs better and better paid. And surely that should be a priority for a government at a time like this. We also know that the higher your productivity, the less likely you are to see ongoing inflationary pressures. And so that's why it's an immediate concern as well as a longer term one.
Next question comes from Patrick Commons from The Australian.
Thanks very much. My question is around better pay. Today, the Fair Work Commission is holding hearings into the minimum wage decision, and unions are pushing for 7% minimum wage increase. Employers are more like 3.5% to 4%. Where does the coalition, or where do you sit in this spectrum of kind of wage rises, or where do you think the ultimate wage rise decision?
Well, I mean, Pat, what we ultimately want is what I think all Australians want, which is higher real wages for all Australians. I mean, that's why I was talking about productivity, because that's one of the ways you can achieve it. If you can make it easier for someone to do their job, their employer can pay them more. And it's a pretty simple formula. It's worked for the world for several hundred years in an incredibly effective way. And so that is hugely important. We want to see those real wage increases. The pathway to that will include needing to put downward pressure on inflation. We respect the Fair Work Commission as an independent arbiter on these things, and it will make its decisions, and we've always taken that approach. But if we want higher real wages, the key is get inflation down. The denominator is not the only part of this. The denominator is the bit you've actually got to get down. The numerator, of course, is one part of it. But you've got to ultimately get real wages up, and getting inflation down is the key to that.
The Prime Minister said on that today, workers should not go backwards. Do you agree with that principle for this decision? Well,
workers are going backwards at the moment, Thomas. Can I call you that?
You may.
Workers are going backwards at the moment. I mean, this is the point. Inflation, there's two parts to your real wage, the actual nominal wage and prices. And if inflation is running wild, then workers are worse off. And one of the pieces of this budget that's really important to note is real wages are stagnant in this term of Parliament. Now, Labor promised an increase in real wages before the election, and they themselves in these budget papers have admitted in this term in Parliament, this 3 years, it ain't going to be delivered. And that's incredibly disappointing.
This is one of the few areas where the economy, though, there's a direct intervention, if you like. That was the Labor principle. Don't go backwards. In other words, give a pay rise in line with inflation. Would that be dangerous, do you think?
Well, again, I'll leave that to the Fair Work Commission. But what I will say is if you want real wages to go up, if you want the standard of living to go up, if you want people's quality of life to go up, then you've got to get inflation down and take those pressures off people's cost of living. Okay. And that has to be the focus for government.
Rachel Clune from the SMH and The Age.
Rachel Clune from The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. Inflation, one of the major drivers of inflation is rents, and the Reserve Bank believes that it's going to add substantially to inflation in the coming years. We know that the Coalition's policy on housing is for people to dip into their super, which is a demand-side policy, but what would you do on the supply side?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, Rachel, and it's true, we do think the demand side is part of the answer, and choice in superannuation is, I think, an important part of that. Yeah, and I'll come back to the supply because I know that was the essence of your question. Just to elaborate on the demand side, and we know that if someone can get into a home, if they buy their own home, that is the best indicator of a good retirement. And so we think it's an absolutely appropriate thing for part of your super, modest part of your super, to be included or used to buy a home. On the supply side, it was great to see Paul Fletcher here, a former infrastructure minister, cities minister, and we worked in that portfolio together, and Paul worked in that portfolio for longer than I did. This was an important focus for us in government. City deals, of course, were all about making sure you don't just get new housing, but you get the roads, you get the job centres, you get all the other infrastructure, the services, and you have all three levels of government working together to achieve that. I mean, this is the point. Great communities aren't one thing. There are a whole series of things that all three levels of government have got to deliver in a collaborative way. And that's how we're going to end up with great communities that can support growth of our economy, but not communities that leave whole groups of people or large parts of the population with congestion, with underserviced housing estates and so on, which is the real risk here and is frankly what we saw in New South Wales under the previous Labor government there, which was such a dangerous place for New South Wales and Australia to be.
Next question from Fiona Whelan from Network 9.
Mr Taylor, thank you for your speech. New figures show annual wage growth has reached its highest point since 2012. Labor was in charge then too. The Coalition has said a lot about the working poor. Do workers end up poorer under the Coalition?
The key is real wages growth. That's what we want to see, Fee, and the way to get that is lower inflation. Now, the truth is that we've seen a dramatic increase in inflation in the last 12 months and a very dramatic, this is the key, a very dramatic reduction in real wages. I mean, sharp reduction. And so there's one game in town here right now. There is one game in town here to get people's prosperity up, to help them with their standard of living at a time when they feel worse off. And that is to take pressure off prices. We want to see higher real wages, I can tell you. I think it's hugely important to everybody in this room. I'm sure everyone agrees. So that's the key.
Do you give Labor credit for that wages growth?
Well, they're getting no real wages growth at the moment. They're actually been going backwards. This is why I started, my opening question was, do you feel better or worse off than a year ago? You know, and I think the answer for most Australians is very clear.
Next question, Paul Karp from The Guardian.
Thanks very much for your speech, Mr Taylor. The government has criticised inconsistent costings of your job seeker policy to raise the income-free threshold, varying from $700 million to $2.3 billion, and said that the policy would mean 50,000 people currently in work would be eligible for the payment. Could I please ask, what does that policy cost, and is that 50,000 people an unintended bug or an intended feature of the policy?
Well, Paul, can I start by saying, if it is true that the government is using departmental resources to attack the opposition rather than to attack inflation, they should be upfront about that. And I think that's very disappointing for everybody that they would use departmental resources in that way if they have, and I think that's a very real question to ask. Now, we know that this is a policy that has the potential to get more people into work, despite what some in the opposition have tried to claim. I mean, it's very simple at the end of the day. If you give people a stronger incentive to work, what do you think they're likely to want to do? They're going to want to work more. I mean, right now, the disincentive is 60 cents in the dollar once you get to a certain threshold. 60 cents or 50 cents if you're on the lower threshold in the dollar that you lose if you work more. And we're saying take that away. And the result of that is we believe there'll be more people working. Now, we will work through our costings now that we've got the full parameters of the budget. We didn't have that until last week. We'll work through that over the coming weeks. But we can fully expect that the costs of our policy will be substantially lower than Labor's.
Did they go through PBO?
As I say, we will work through with the PBO now we've got the budget parameters, but we fully expect that the costing... Look, this is how opposition policies work, as you know, Tom. There's a time-honoured tradition around this. Once we've got the parameters of the budget, we can actually work those through, but we fully expect they will be substantially lower cost than Labor's. But you know what? If Labor's doing the work, if they're doing opposition attack work through the department, they should bring forward the numbers. I do note, by the way, that there was a very good speech by the Secretary of the Treasury back at the beginning of April, where he talked about effective marginal tax rates for the unemployed and how important it was to look at ways of providing incentive to get into work when in fact because of the tax and transfer system, they're paying effectively an effective tax rate of 50 to 60 cents in the dollar. And I think that was an important speech. But as I say, if Labor has done costings on this, they should release those costings.
Anna Henderson from SBS and NITV.
Thank you. Anna Henderson from SBS World News. Excuse me. A group of neo-Nazis congregated in Melbourne on the weekend for an anti-immigration rally at the same time as your opposition was prosecuting an argument with concerns about migration. So what do you say to those in migrant communities who point to the rhetoric of the opposition as emboldening fascism and also making them feel more fearful of being attacked in Australia's streets?
Oh, Anna, I just reject that. Neo-Nazism, I can't reject it strongly enough. And I think Peter Dutton's been very clear about that. And any association of our agenda with that, I think, is just wrong. And I won't be drawn on it because it's right. I mean, of course not. Look, we want the right thing for all Australians.
I guess the question is, did you take into consideration as you were formulating your response to the budget that there could be unintended consequences of focusing on migration?
We don't take responsibility for the behaviour of nutters in Melbourne. I mean, if they're going to go and do that sort of stuff, we can't take responsibility for their heinous behaviour, and we certainly don't condone it, but we will argue the case for what's right for Australia every day of the week, and of course that's what we're doing here.
Thank you.
Next question, Ben Westcott from Bloomberg.
Thank you so much for your speech, Shadow Treasurer. Ben Westcott from Bloomberg. I just want to take you back to Rachel's question, which, with great respect, you didn't answer. The supply side of the coalition's policy. So Labor has its Housing Future Fund before Parliament, but you don't support that. You could put more spending into the budget to solve this, but that would be inflationary. And the Greens have some ideas as well involving tax changes, but I suspect you probably wouldn't support those. What can the coalition suggest to help solve the housing crisis?
Can I make the point that entire analysis that you've just given us says the private sector has nothing to do with this and that their investment is not the main source of new housing? I mean, the idea that if you want new housing, the government's got to build it could only come from the Labor Party. It could only come from the Labor Party. I mean, what a ridiculous notion. Every builder out there, every construction company, every tradie building a house right now should be saying, oh, yeah, well, you know, is the answer that I work for the government? I mean, that's, honestly, it's preposterous. And that's why Labor's policy is, it is, apart from the fact that in terms of numbers it's a drop in the ocean, I mean, it rests on the idea that governments becoming active in the building industry is the answer to the problem here. And we saw with NRAS, which was Labor's last attempt at it, you know, what a disaster that approach was. Now, the key is, and this is the point I was making about city deals, they are all about activating the private sector to get on with the job alongside sensible, targeted infrastructure from government. And it's about your priorities. I mean, it's good to see Bridget McKenzie here, who is passionate about making sure the $120 billion infrastructure pipeline is going to the right projects that's going to get the right outcomes for exactly the sorts of things we're talking about here. Now, we've seen Labor reallocate that to some of their pet projects that don't even pass cost-benefit analyses on any real scrutiny. So, you know, there is no shortage of resources in Australia to do this. Much of it, if not most of it, will come from the private sector, but government has a role to play through initiatives like city deals, through the way infrastructure investment is allocated in making sure that we get that complementarity in growth. Housing, services, infrastructure, communities, all the things we want.
You had 9 years of the coalition at a federal level and also basically zero immigration for a couple of years and somehow a housing crisis. Whatever approach that was doesn't seem to have worked.
Well, I mean, the problem we've got is this. I'm looking forward, Tom. 1.5 million additional immigrants coming into the country and without any kind of plan that's going to get even close to dealing with that.
Well, the previous approaches failed as well.
You know, I look forward, Tom, and that's the key in government. I look back and I say we did actually have a big impact on housing. If you want to talk about track record, we saw in New South Wales, for instance, when the Liberals got into government in New South Wales in 2011, in the lead up to that, in fact, up to about 2012, we were seeing 14,000 houses a year being built in New South Wales. we got up to 30 to 40,000 houses a year being built during that time period. Now, I have deep fears. And that was dealing with a backlog and knocking that backlog out. And, you know, the work that Paul and myself and others did, if you go out and see the Western Sydney Airport and the work that is going on out there, it's just truly remarkable. Unbelievable work, some of which is in my electorate, but right across that region there's been just incredible work being done. And so we have been dealing with the backlog. The real challenge though, looking forward, is with 1.5 million plus organic population growth, I mean, reasonable, very credible estimates that we're going to see 900,000 additional total population growth in Australia in the next 2 years. Where's Labor's plan to deal with that?
So just to follow up very quickly, you're absolutely right about the private sector and about migration, but we haven't seen the private sector fill those gaps. And if you talk to the private sector, they talk about supply shortages. They talk about unable to get the equipment they need, the builders they need. We've seen companies folding. I mean, don't they need some assistance?
Well, look, you know, we did see the private sector doing that because nearly all of those houses I just talked about, probably just about all of them, were being built by the private sector in New South Wales. So we know how to mobilise the private sector. We did it, and New South Wales was where the challenge was the biggest during that time period. But looking forward, yeah, we do need a plan. We do need a plan from Labor. I mean, that's my point. I think actually on that we're in furious agreement. We're not seeing, I mean, the fact that Labor could bring down a budget like this with those huge numbers, recognise, I mean, they actually lay it out in the budget papers, the challenge they've got with housing. But, you know, what have we got from them? Reviews. I mean, yeah, and an infrastructure plan where they're just reallocating to their pet projects. I mean, we can do better than that.
Okay.
Thanks very much.
Next question, Julie Hare from the AFR.
Thank you. You've spoken a lot about income tax today and how it's a drain on pay and productivity. Would a future coalition government be open to a switch in the tax mix, such as increasing the GST to fund a reduction in income tax?
Well, I mean, the coalition is a believer in lower taxes, not higher taxes. And as I said in my speech, we know that when you're driving improvement in your budget position, if you do it by managing the growth in spending, you get stronger growth than if you do it by raising taxes. And so we do want to see lower taxes, not higher taxes. That's because we know in the end it delivers for all Australians. It actually gives you a stronger, faster growing economy. It pays for the services we want. It pays for the infrastructure that we need to make sure we get the housing in place and so on. That's what we want to see. We don't want to see higher taxes, and I think what you're implicitly arguing there is a higher GST. That's certainly not on our radar.
But so it could be a higher GST with lower income tax, and you can stick to 23.9. It's about the mix.
But it's still a higher GST, Tom. So that's not in our plan.
Okay, fair enough. Next question, Katie McLeod from NCA Newswires.
Thanks, Mr. Taylor, for your speech. I'd like to ask you about something you said in your address when you said inflation is coming from Canberra now, not the Kremlin. But around the time that the coalition government you were a part of handed down its last budget, former Prime Minister Scott Morrison blamed inflation on factors outside of the government's control, such as Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So I'd like to ask you what's changed between then and now? Why was inflation something that was outside of the coalition's control, but is now, as you say, able to be controlled by Labor, especially given the war in Ukraine is still going?
Well, the key to answering that question is that we're not in government, Labor is now. So it's within their control and it's not within ours. But I've laid out what I think is an agenda that will address it, and that's our strong focus. I mean, it is clear when you look at the history of how inflation flowed through. It started with energy, there's no question about that. I mean, I was in roundtables with energy ministers around the world in real crisis in 2021 because of what was happening and going into 2022, obviously, after the Ukraine invasion happened. And there was a real sense that there was a challenge there, and globally, and that flowed through to prices over time. No doubt about that. But the truth of the matter is Labor hasn't dealt with it. They haven't dealt with it. And this is the real challenge. I mean, you know, when you want to get prices of something down, you've got to get more supply in, and Labor's gone in exactly the opposite direction. Now, more broadly, what we've seen over time is prices have increased for absolutely everything, right across the board. It's not just one particular sector, it's absolutely everything. And that's why now it's very clear that if you want to deal with it, you've actually got to deal with it from Canberra. Fiscal policy has to play a role.
So on that, when you're mulling over what you'll sort of give the thumbs up and thumbs down to, would your net decision making mean a less expansionary theoretical budget or not expansionary at all?
No, I think the reality is you need to have a budget that's going to put downward pressure on prices, and you know that means that when you're spending an extra $185 billion, you're simply not doing that. And it's very hard to find an economist to say that this budget is putting any downward pressure on inflation, Tom. You'll find some that'll say, oh, well, could have been worse, but actually it's neutral. And a lot who'll say, no, actually, it's made the situation worse. But the job of government right now is to take responsibility and make the situation better. And what's very clear is the budget didn't do that.
Nabil Nashar from ABC.
Nabil Nashar from ABC News. You've really drawn a hard line in the sand here on the migration figure, the 1.5 million. Even though the facts show it's a rebound from an equally historic dip during the pandemic. Now, considering the fact that in the last year your party has lost government, lost its last foothold in the mainland, lost the Aston by-election, and considering the fact that half of modern-day Australians are either immigrants or born to immigrants, are you the least bit worried that this kind of rhetoric on migration is tone-deaf or could further alienate voters from the Liberal Party?
Well, it's very important you don't verbal any of us on migration because what we're against is unmanaged migration. And this is the point. As I said, I grew up in a great migrant town. If you go down around the main park in Cooma, it's not far from here, an hour from here, you'll see flags from every country that worked on the Snowy. And there's a lot of colour and a lot of flags.
But are you worried
I grew up with
people are going to see
in my blood, let me tell you, in my blood. But I learnt from what I saw is if it's unmanaged, if there's not jobs, if there's not infrastructure, if there's not services, if there's not housing, then it simply doesn't work.
So you're not worried about
unmanaged
voters?
Migration is the problem, and the problem we've got from this government is they've got all the numbers in there. They say it's not a plan, Tom. Well, last time I looked, a budget was a plan. But anyway.
My point about that, it's a forecast, and what Nabil was talking about is a lot of catch-up from students. We need skilled migrants. We need aged care workers. Are you saying you don't actually have a problem with the 1.5? Is that
I am saying our problem is with unmanaged migration. And if you don't have those complementary initiatives, it won't work. It will fail. And that is where this government is heading, headlong. 900,000 more Australians in the next 2 years with no plan for that. This is not the right answer. And it's important that in opposition we call it out because it'll hurt all Australians if it goes wrong. I mean, the worst thing of all is that Australians have been very, I think, accommodating towards one of the highest migration rates in the world. Very accommodating. But that accommodation is stretched if the roads are stretched, if the housing is stretched.
Just to clarify, I'm looking for an answer on whether you're worried about migrant community sentiment to your party.
Look, I'm going to do what's right for all Australians, including migrant communities. I mean, and we see migrant communities in Western Sydney that want to see Western Sydney working for everybody, working in terms of the infrastructure and housing. So I don't want to separate Australians out. I mean, this is, as I said, one of my concerns about this budget is it divides Australians, not uniting them. We're all in this. We are genuinely all in this together, and we've got to make sure that we get the right outcome for all Australians, and that's why having a managed migration plan is the right answer.
All right. Thank you. Simon Love from Sky News has the next question.
Thanks, Tom. Mr Taylor, thanks for your speech. My question, at the risk of setting off a state of origin war within the room, and I can see Michaelia Cash over there and Dean Smith and Bridget McKenzie, but Victoria and other states have said that they're not getting a fair share of the GST at the moment. Would the coalition under you as Treasurer review the GST deal that gives more GST receipts to Western Australia and also the majority to New South Wales when the population of Melbourne is about to take over the population of Sydney?
We've got no plan to change the GST deal that was done. I mean, and we think that it struck the right balance. It's never easy. I mean, these things, the Federation, as you rightly say, has been fighting on the sporting field and on the economic field for as long as anyone can, as long as the Federation's existed, back to 1901. And I'm sure it will continue to, and it's all part of the great Australian tradition. But we've got to ultimately strike a balance that gets it right, recognises the enormous contribution that WA has played in recent years, and we see it in our budget. I mean, I've got to say, in the budget right now, the role of commodity exports has been hugely important to getting to that position where a drover's dog could deliver a surplus.
But isn't international students, say, important too for, say, Sydney and Melbourne as well? And it's not the same obvious tangible thing as a resource in the ground.
Well, as I say, we think that deal struck the right balance, and we've got no plan to change it.
It cost billions more than it was meant or forecast. Was it at least a watching brief?
Well, as I say, I mean, I'm not going to change my answer, Tom. I think I've given it.
Okay. Michelle Slater from ACM Canberra Times.
G'day. So you've said that this budget is inflationary and it is delivering little for Middle Australia. So which of the cost of living measures would you be scrapping?
No, the point I would make is this. When you add $185 billion of spending, you're not getting to the source of the problem. You're making it worse. You're adding fuel to the fire. And the truth is, then you end up in a position where the only thing left is to deal with the symptom. And, that is like putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. Now, I'm not saying, if you've got a Band-Aid and there's a bullet wound, you probably put it on there. But the truth is that is just the wrong way to go about this. To add, I mean, it's an extraordinary number. And I'll just say it again because it's just $185 billion of extra spending in 12 months. And you think that's not inflationary? And this answers the question earlier about the coalition versus now. That's since PFO, since we left government. So that's the source, and alongside of that, a whole series of policies in energy that I've talked about, industrial relations and other areas that are all risk being highly inflationary over time. So you end up with this situation where you've got a government that's only answer is to put that Band-Aid on the bullet wound. Well, it's a terrible position to be in, but it didn't need to be thus.
So would you be scrapping the entire cost of living package?
No, we've been very clear. There's initiatives we support there because we've got to a point where Labor has left no choice. I mean, we don't bring down an alternative budget. We respond to the budget in front of us. And in the budget in front of us, we've said there's a number of initiatives that we have opposed, including $45 billion of spending in recent months, with $18 billion of interest costs attached to that. We stand by that position because that would take some of the pressure off inflation. But the truth of the matter is Labor has got itself into a position where Australians are hurting badly because inflation is making them poorer, and there's no choice but to deal with the way they have. So they're dealing with the symptom, not the source.
A lot of people would agree with you on the inflationary test, but taking us to the March 22 budget, there was an environment of increasing inflation around the world, forecast for the biggest increase in inflation in Australia in the following year. The last coalition budget put another $17 billion in the economy, including Lamito, up to $1,500 in taxpayers' pockets. The Treasurer was saying there's $250 billion out there in savings. In hindsight, with the benefit in hindsight, was that a mistake?
Look, the reality is every budget has to deal with the context it has. And the context of that was coming out of the pandemic, and we, as I said, had a remarkable V-shaped recovery. I don't think anyone could have anticipated how strong it was going to be. The budget was in surplus from November 2021 through to the election, Tom. I mean, that's where it was at. This budget and the last budget in October has been about fighting those inflationary demons, and it's failed.
All right. the raffle's been won by Phil Curry today. No Met tray, but a second question instead.
I'll give you the sausages. Just a bit out of left field, Mr Taylor. September this year is when Dr Phil Lowe's tenure as RBA Governor ends. The government consulted you extensively on the RBA review, and they usually run it past the opposition when they appoint a new governor. Who would you like to see take the job, Dr Lowe, or have you got someone else you'd be recommending to Jim Chalmers?
They consult. They don't necessarily ask for advice. They're not the same thing, Phil. But I have appreciated the collaborative and bipartisan approach to the review. I think it's been important. I think that the RBA, whilst it's clear it's made errors in the recent past, and people have paid a high price for those errors. I also think it is an incredibly important institution in our country. It did help to slay those inflation demons of the 70s and 80s that I talked about earlier, and the worst thing we could do now is undermine it. That's why I am always so cautious about criticising decisions. They're decisions by an independent Reserve Bank. We want the very best people available to be making those decisions on the Reserve Bank board and the Monetary Policy Board if we get to that. I won't make any commentary on who should be in what position, but I will say we want the very best, and that is hugely important. It is also important that it be the right person for the job, and I've made comments after appointments have been made in the recent past about making sure that due process has been followed in making those appointments.
Yeah, thanks.
Mr Taylor, thank you for your time. Please accept our gift of membership to the club. Everyone, would you please thank Shadow Treasurer?
Thanks.
Thanks, mate.
Good